Hi everyone, so it is 5 o'clock now, so we will be getting started. I'd like to welcome you to the public open house for the commercial growth and production and medical growth of cannabis. My name is Mackenzie Cece, I'm the planning technician at the town, and we're joined here by our panelists this evening and our open house hosts. And so I'm just going to start by giving a few instructions on how you can participate this evening. So everyone in the waiting room at this time, I believe, has received a speaker number and has been contacted by email. So we will be bringing people into the webinar according to their speaker number. You will have up to 10 minutes to speak and provide your comments. And if time does permit and you still have additional comments, we will bring you in and you can continue to share at that point in time. But we will be starting with a brief presentation and we'll begin with the speaking portion after that. So I'll hand it over to you, Lindsay.
Thanks, Mackenzie. And it looks like we have most of our people here, so I'm just going to get right into it. So I'd like to welcome everyone and say thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. My name is Lindsay Richardson, and I'm the Senior Community Planner with the Town of Fort Erie. Tonight, in conjunction with SGL Planning, we're hosting a public open house with respect to proposed amendments that we're looking at making to the town's official plan, the town zoning bylaw, and our site plan control bylaw. These amendments are being made to implement the recommendations of the Cannabis Legislation and Policy Review Study Recommendations Report that was approved by Council in July of this year. I'm joined tonight again by Mackenzie Cece from the town, who most of you have spoken with, as well as Paul Lowe's and Suzanne McDonald from SGL Planning and Design. They will be giving a brief presentation. And once that presentation is complete, we will be opening the virtual floor to those who wish to speak. As Mackenzie noted, registered speakers will have up to 10 minutes to speak. And once we've gone through the list of speakers, and if time permits, we'll open the floor to anyone else who wishes to speak. Or if, as one of the registered speakers, you have more input that you'd like to provide, you're more than welcome to once everyone's had a chance to have their 10 minutes. Just an additional note, and I know I'm probably sounding like a bit of a broken record because I think that I've said this at the beginning of every one of our cannabis-related meetings. We are not going to be focusing on or really able to provide responses to comments, questions, or concerns as they relate to illegal grow ops, really, or the federal legislation that permits the growth or retail sale of cannabis. These are topics that were outside the scope of the proposed amendments. Completely appreciate that there are concerns around these issues. However, the topic of this meeting and the purpose of these amendments is to establish new policies and regulations regarding specific permissions for the cultivation of cannabis and related processing uses within specific designations and zones in the town. A lot to take in there. If you do have concerns related to the illegal grow ops and or the federal legislation, please feel free to contact me directly or through the town's Let's Talk Fort Erie site, and I'll ensure that the comments are passed on to the appropriate contacts. Just as another kind of mention, again, I'll encourage everyone to visit www.letstalkforterie.ca to check out the site dealing with cannabis. You can provide feedback through the site, and it's also the main source of communication for this project. It includes all the background information, all of the reports that we've done. There's a section of frequently asked questions. There's a copy of this presentation as well as previous presentations and links to a number of different federal legislation sites and information. The site is updated fairly regularly, and hopefully all of the draft documents are now available for review on there. So please just make sure that you have a look around, and if you do want to stay informed, there is a stay informed link at the bottom of the page. I'm going to turn the meeting over now to Suzanne and Paul. And again, I thank you all for your participation. Suzanne, take it away.
Great, thank you, Lindsay. Just going to screen share my presentation. Can I confirm that everyone can see that okay? Excellent. So again, I echo Lindsay's sentiment. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'll be doing a brief presentation on the work that we've done so far as part of this study, and talking a little bit about our recommendations for addressing cannabis as a land use within the town of Fort Erie. So I wanted to start with what our study purpose is. And through this study, we look to examine opportunities for the town to regulate activities permitted under the Cannabis Act, specifically the growing of cannabis and the production of cannabis as a land use. As part of this, we set out to assess and recommend any changes to the town's official plan, zoning bylaw, in order to regulate cannabis as a cannabis production as a land use. So in terms of the scope of our project, we are specifically looking at the land uses related to the commercial cultivation and processing of recreational and medical cannabis. Two things that are actually outside the scope of our work includes the personal growth of recreational cannabis. Under the Cannabis Act, any individual or dwelling is permitted to grow up to 4 plants within their household. That's not part of the scope of our study, as well as standalone retail sale of recreational cannabis that is regulated at the provincial level. And that also falls outside of the scope of the study as well. And just in terms of where we are in our study process, this has been a 4-phase study and we're in phase 4. And so phase 1 was a background review where we looked at a number of items, including the federal legislation, as well as the planning framework in Fort Erie currently, as well as we did a best practice of what other municipalities have done with regards to cannabis as a land use. We also in phase 2 came up with a number of policy options and the pros and cons of different options for addressing cannabis production as a land use. And then also in phase 3, we came up with our recommendations. So now we're into phase 4, where again, I'll be presenting my recommendations as well tonight. And as part of that, we actually have prepared the tools to implement those recommendations, which are available online. And I'll be speaking a little bit more about those later in my presentation. So in terms of our previous work, I kind of alluded to this on the last slide a little bit, but we looked at the legal framework and provincial documents that are relevant within the planning context. We also looked at Fort Erie's existing planning tools, including the official plan, the zoning bylaw, and the site plan control bylaw. I mentioned that we looked at a number of different municipalities, some local to Niagara region and others more broader within Ontario, to understand how they address cannabis as a land use within both their official plans and zoning bylaws. And then we came up with a number of options for the town to consider. And we also had some previous public engagements, both through an online survey that was posted on the town's website and a previous virtual open house, which I believe some of you also attended with us. And just at a high level, I wanted to go over how production of cannabis is regulated within Canada. So if an individual or a corporation wishes to produce cannabis for commercial purposes, so for sale, whether recreational or for medical purposes, they need a license from Health Canada. And there are a number of different licenses that can be applied for. One is for cultivation, either standard or micro cultivation. There's nurseries. There's also licenses for processing, sale for medical purposes, which occurs through the mail, analytical testing and research, etc. Now you'll note that on this slide that there's not just listed normal retail, and that's because that's regulated by the province and not by the federal government. So independent of this licensing process, if someone wished to open a store to sell, that would be regulated at the provincial level. So I mentioned that we also took a look at what is currently within the town of Fort Erie's planning documents. So we reviewed the official plan, including official plan amendment number 18, which actually introduced medical marijuana policies within the official plan. And that terminology of marijuana versus cannabis related to the legislation in force at the time, which permitted facilities that could grow marijuana only or cannabis only for medical purposes, because at that time commercial use of the product was not permitted. But so the current official plan addresses production for medical purposes and permits it within the agricultural, rural, and open space designations, as well as the industrial business park designation. And also under the official plan, it specifies that this use is subject to site plan control and also requires that the use have regard for the Ministry of Environment D6 guidelines in determining an appropriate separation distance for this type of use. So that's the existing policy as it stands in the official plan today. And then we also looked at the existing zoning framework. So in the zoning bylaw currently, again, there's a defined use, which is a medical marijuana and grow production facility. I've got the definition listed up on the slide. And this use is permitted currently in the agricultural, rural, industrial, and prestige industrial zones. And then because of the way the term agricultural use is defined, it actually encompasses that use. So it would be permitted wherever that agricultural uses are permitted, including the extractive industrial zone, existing open space zone, and the hazard zone. And then also currently, the site plan control bylaw also requires that medical marijuana grow production facilities would go through a site plan control process as well, which is a municipal process and application that allows the town a chance to review the site layout of a new facility. So from all the background work that we've done over the last several months on this project, we've come up with a number of recommendations for the town, which is what I'm going to be going over with you in the next few slides. So at a high level, we recommend that that the town permit and regulate both licensed facilities and designated medical growth. And I'll just speak a little bit more about what I mean by that. So when I say licensed facilities, I'm talking about the sort of the large commercial facilities that you need a license for from Health Canada that I was speaking to a little bit earlier when I was on one of the previous slides. In terms of designated medical growth, what I'm referring to there is if someone has a medical prescription for cannabis, they are permitted to grow the cannabis that they need for their prescription, provided that they register with Health Canada. And there are instances where someone can, if they choose, designate someone else to grow that prescription on their behalf. And there's also permission for multiple prescriptions to be grown together. So when I say designated medical growth, we're looking at specifically where more than one prescription is being grown together, because up to 4 can be grown together. So throughout the next few slides, when I'm talking about regulating the use, we're talking about both the larger licensed facilities that are growing for commercial purposes and the designated medical growth. We've got more than one medical prescription being grown together. And so we're recommending that these uses be permitted as of right in agricultural and rural areas, as well as in industrial areas, and that they do not require site-specific zoning bylaw amendment, but do require this to go through the site plan control process. Now, for all of those, our recommendation that for those is only that for indoor cultivation. We're not recommending that any outdoor cultivation be permitted within the town. And this is primarily because there's no way to mitigate odor without enclosing the cultivation of cannabis within a building. So when I'm talking about the permissions, I'm talking specifically about indoor cultivation. So in terms of the official plan, in order to implement these recommendations, we need to go forward with an official plan amendment to introduce new policies. So specifically, to introduce policies for cannabis cultivation in the agricultural and rural areas. And specifically, these policies would be that cultivation occur within an enclosed building and that it not emit any odor. And that's consistent with the federal regulations. And also that the use occur in accordance with all applicable federal regulations. Also that the buildings be a minimum of 150 meters away from sensitive land uses, such as your schools or your dwellings, places of worship, daycare, etc., except where a residence is on the same lot. And also that buildings be a minimum of 500 meters to a school as per staff's recommendation. We also recommend that the use be subject to site plan control, and this policy would detail that the site plan control process may require submissions of studies, for example, an air quality control study, environmental impact studies, traffic and lighting studies, to basically show the municipality that what's proposed is not going to have any nuisances. and also implementing a requirement specific to the agricultural and rural areas that an accessory use must occur on the same lot as cultivation. Any of those uses would be subject to the same policy. So if they're processing or packaging any crop that's been cultivated, that would all be subject to the same regulations. And we also would introduce similar policies for an employment area, except in this case, because it's an employment area, cultivation would not be required on the lot. So for example, a facility would be permitted to simply, obviously with the proper federal permissions, but would be permitted to simply package and process the use, or some cannabis rather. And next, we also recommended an update to the zoning bylaw through a zoning bylaw amendment. So we'd want to update the zoning to define the two distinct types of cannabis growth that I discussed earlier. So the licensed cannabis production facilities, which are your larger commercial facilities, as well as designated medical growth of cannabis, specifically where you've got more than one prescription being grown together, and one of them is by a designated grower. Next, we want to list both of those uses as permitted as of right in the agricultural, rural, and industrial and prestige industrial zones. And lastly, we would want to replace the definition of agricultural to exclude these uses so that these are a defined separate use from any other agricultural use. So it wouldn't just be permitted wherever agricultural uses are permitted. It would only be permitted specifically where these uses are listed as permitted within the zoning bylaw. And as part of this, we'd also be updating the bylaw to remove, basically replace the previous terminology of the medical marijuana facilities and update it with this new terminology that aligns with the current permissions under the Cannabis Act. Additional requirements are included in the zoning bylaw amendments within the respective zones. And these relate to what I was speaking to earlier in terms of the official plan policies, but the requirements include a minimum separation distance for indoor operations of 150 meters from sensitive land uses. That could be measured lot to lot. For example, you require 150 meters from the lot, a neighboring lot that contains a dwelling. Also, minimum 500 meter separation from a school as per staff's recommendation. We also implemented a restriction on outdoor storage and a requirement for the use to not emit any odor, as well as a requirement for the use to operate entirely within an enclosed building. So those 5 requirements that I just spoke of would apply to all 4 of the zones that that the use would be permitted in. In addition, the agricultural zones and the rural zones also require that any of the use must be accessory to cultivation. So cultivation has to occur on the same property. And also a farm product market would not be permitted. And that's the way farm product market is defined under the zoning bylaw would permit sale of the cannabis. So that would not be permitted as an accessory use to a cannabis facility within the agricultural and rural zones. So this slide shows a high level of the proposed changes to the zoning through a zoning bylaw amendment. But the full zoning bylaw amendment is available on the town's website. And I'll speak to where that is later. So if you want to get the full details and read the actual amendment itself, that is available for you as well. And then lastly, we recommend updating the site plan control bylaw. So this requires 2 changes. One, within the official plan, where it outlines what types of uses are subject to the site plan control process. We'd want to update it to make sure that this type of use is subject to site plan control. And as I mentioned, this allows the town the opportunity to request and review studies to ensure, among other things, that odor control is appropriate and that any potential nuisances can be appropriately mitigated. And also, we'd go ahead and update the site plan control exemption policy bylaw so that this use is not exempt. So we make sure that this type of use would have to go through that site plan control process. So to kind of summarize everything I've gone over quite quickly here, the recommendation is to update the official plan to permit the indoor to permit the use cannabis production cultivation indoors in the agricultural, rural, and industrial business park designations, as well as permit the use indoor as of right in the agricultural, rural, industrial, and prestige industrial zones with the specific requirements that I've outlined as part of this presentation. But outdoor growth is not recommended. And then, of course, making this use subject to site plan control. So the next steps for this study will be to have a statutory public meeting, which is scheduled for December 6th. And as I mentioned, the specific amendments and the wording of these amendments are available online. They're found at the Let's Talk Fort Erie page under Cannabis. So if you wanted to see a little bit more detail of everything that I've been speaking about this evening, all that detail is found within those amendments. And as Lindsay mentioned as well, our background reports that walked through all the background work that we did, which I spoke a little bit about this evening, as well as how we came up with our recommendations and all the decisions that went into that, all that's detailed in our report. So this is quite high level, but a lot of more information is available online. So that's it for my presentation. I'm going to pass it back over to Lindsay. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. And I think I will sort of defer to Mackenzie, and maybe we can bring our first person in.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lindsay. So I'd now like to invite our first speaker to speak this evening. So I will be bringing Eleanor into the webinar at this time. And just a quick reminder that you do have up to 10 minutes to speak. And if time does permit, we will have you come back in if you have anything else that you'd like to add. So I'll be bringing Eleanor in now.
Mute.
Hey, Eleanor.
Thank you for letting me in.
No
great
problem.
presentation, Susan. That was very clear. I do have a couple of questions that I hope that you could clarify some information for me. The first one was the recommendation to prohibit the farm product sale for agricultural and rural zones. So just like the reasoning behind that recommendation, where as in all other agricultural industries within the Fort Erie Township, the farm product market is allowed.
Yes. So actually, I'm going to defer to Lindsay on this one because this was something that came out of our previous discussions with the town. So maybe Lindsay, I'll let you start and I can add to it.
Sure.
But...
And I think the main factor and the main point is that essentially the sale of cannabis is regulated through the province. So our thought was that it's because it's regulated through the province and you have to have a specific license to be able to sell that, to do it this way. Like, so I understand what you're saying, Eleanor, completely. Like, certainly if you're growing, tomatoes, you can sell them at the farm. But in this case, because of the way that it's regulated in terms of sale, we just didn't feel that it was appropriate to permit that use. So that was sort of the rationale behind that.
So as you guys know, I do have a cannabis facility in St. Catharines, and we actually are licensed for retail as well. So we do adhere to all of the federal, provincial, and municipal bylaws, and we haven't found, and neither have the government bodies found, that there has been any issues in regards to this. So I guess I would just oppose that recommendation for the agricultural and rural zones.
Sure. If I can just say as well, like if you are licensed to do it, then I think that's a bit of a different conversation. So I think the intent here is just simply, we certainly don't want someone growing in the agricultural area and just, selling it sort of willy-nilly. So if you are licensed to do it, that's a whole other conversation that I think we have.
Okay, so just to clarify, so right now with the new bylaws coming into force, it's prohibited as of right to sell, but if we went through you have to go through the process of getting a license through the province in order to sell retail, right? So if how would that process go about if someone on an agricultural rural property were to go through that process? Or it would also for new people coming into the industry looking for property within, say, Fort Erie, they may disregard agricultural rural zones because of that prohibition, where it may not actually be the case because we still go through all the licensing procedures just the same as at the federal level.
Sure, that's fair. And I think in that case, what we would do is we would be looking at it on a case-by-case basis. So while we're prohibiting it currently, you would certainly be able to go through the rezoning process and get that use permitted. But again, I think the concern was just that it might open it up to people that weren't licensed. So we'd rather control it that way versus just sort of, everyone can do it. So, but that's a really, really great point. And I'm certainly going to take that point down and into consideration. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, because I think the zoning language would be very similar to the federal language that you're putting into the zoning bylaws in regards to the requirement to have a license in order to execute that activity on this property. Okay, great. I was also wondering, I didn't see anything in the recommendations or in the draft bylaws about retail sale in industrial zones. Was that a concern as well, or something that was brought up, or is it even allowed? I was looking at the section 27 of the bylaw, and I didn't see retail as an accessory use to any activity within that.
So that is one that we are okay with the retail sale in the industrial areas. I'll double check that. I'm not sure. I don't know if we had to specifically note it or if it's just sort of captured in the rest of the zoning requirements for the industrial, but I will make note, but certainly that was the intent, that it would be permitted in the industrial and prestige industrial zones.
Okay, cool. Okay, my next question was, is there a map available of areas that conform to these new requirements, specifically considering the minimum separation distance of 150 meters? I know a lot of municipalities are implementing this requirement, and it's prohibiting a 90 to 95% of the available zones or land that's available for a cannabis business to start up. So I was just wondering if there was a map, or if this was even taken into consideration when implementing the 150 meters, and also what justification there was behind that number.
Sure, I can answer the map question. We don't have anything like that. Suzanne, did you want to speak to the 150 meter justification?
Absolutely. So yeah, so the 150 meter justification primarily comes from our discussions with air quality experts who have modeled and looked at air quality and odor, specifically odor, but air quality with specifically to do with cannabis production and facilities designed for cannabis production. And so it's based specifically on that expertise that the 150 meters basically came from and was confirmed. And I will note that in our best practice review of what other municipalities implemented as well, 150 meters was fairly consistently the most common. So,
and let me just add to that the industrial areas are quite large that can easily accommodate facilities, cannabis facilities in the industrial areas while still meeting 150 meters to surrounding residential zoned properties. In the rural area as well, the farm properties are large enough that you could accommodate on a farm a facility that's 150 meters away. So there's plenty of land with which to accommodate these facilities.
Okay. Is there any possibility of myself or any of the other public reviewing the information acquired from those air quality specialists? I just know, anecdotally, living about 4.5 kilometers away from a mushroom farm, I can smell it. And that's 4.5 kilometers, right? And I mean, your nose, it's totally subjective to your experience with that. It doesn't really bother me, but I know it bothers other people. Same with the cannabis. But I mean, if I'm 150 meters away from a cannabis facility that's emitting odors, I can smell it a kilometer away, right? Or more.
And maybe I can just comment on that. If there's no air filtration, darn right, you're going to smell it
Oh, of
kilometers away.
course. Yeah.
Kilometers away.
Mhm.
What our analysis has done is assuming that there's air filtration, proper air filtration. Even with proper air filtration, there will be instances where odor is emitted from the facility. It happens. And the 150 is modeled as assuming that there's an occasional emittance, how far, how many times it will go. And their feeling is that the majority of that odor on those occasions will be limited to that 150 meters. So that's why we came up with the 150 meters. And just coincidentally that a lot of other municipalities are using it. But if you look at our St. Catharines report, there's a full analysis there from odor expert. Since you've got a facility in St. Catharines, you'd know about the
Right,
study
yeah.
we're also doing in St. Catharines.
Mhm. Okay, thank you very much. My last question, do I have time? It's pretty short.
Yeah, you still have another minute.
Okay, great, thank you. I just wanted clarification on outdoor storage and what that really means.
Yes, so there we have added in a requirement that there be no outdoor storage for this use. With the regulations, obviously, most of the activities that are permitted through the regulations have to happen indoor anyways. However, for additional ability for the town to make sure that this use is appropriately regulated in order to prevent nuisance, that's been added in as well.
And so I guess what I'm looking for is just what does that look like? So when I think of other, say, industrial uses, people have skids outside, they have, garbage cans, they have, maybe they're storing racking or other pieces of equipment, but often it's covered or whatever it may be. Like I'm sure we've all driven through industrial parks and seen what everybody has outside. So I'm just wondering if those things are allowed to be kept outside, or if it's like a blanket, no, it has to be a clean lot, absolutely nothing, just cars for people who work there.
Yeah, outdoor storage means any storage of product or equipment outdoors. So that would not be permitted. Garbage is subject to site plan control, and whatever the standards are of the municipality, whether they require that to be enclosed in a building or sometimes it's enclosed in an outside building. But you're not going to have general storage of garbage strewn through the property in any event. So, but that would be controlled through site plan control.
Okay, and so just a note like that to me, and I'm sure to other people, it's discriminatory since so many other industrial companies and businesses store things outside.
Not in a prestige industrial zone. They don't. That's usually not permitted in a prestige industrial zone. So we don't think it's discriminatory at all.
So in the regular
And
industrial zone,
it's in the federal regulations that you don't store outside. So we're
you don't
basically
store cannabis outside,
right,
but you can store equipment and other materials.
But we're not allowing that in this. It's same with a prestige industrial zone. We wouldn't be allowing it.
Okay, so in industrial zones, I'm just wondering what the justification here is to discriminate against a cannabis business in terms of regular outdoor storage, not of cannabis products.
When we do zoning throughout a municipality, there are certain areas, certain uses that are restricted depending on the type of zone. That's not called discrimination. That's called zoning, and that's how municipalities zone. So in some areas, we permit broader range of uses that may be more heavier orientated. So in a heavy industrial zone, yeah, you could have outdoor storage, but in other areas you don't. And so we're not allowing outdoor storage for this use.
Is there just a question? I know that there are rules and you just have to follow them, and I accept that. I was just wondering if there's a justification for this.
Following through from the federal regulations, no cannabis is stored. We feel that it's proper that no equipment be stored outside as well.
Okay, thank you.
So that does bring us to the 10-minute mark. So Eleanor, if you have anything else later on in time permits, we can bring you back in.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, Eleanor.
Okay, so I'll bring in our next speaker Franco.
Hi, Franco. How are you?
Good. And how about yourselves?
Doing well.
Good. I'm kind of happy that we're at this point and things are being looked at a little more specific. Not to take up all your time. My biggest issue here, it's not an issue, is the odor issue, particularly. Where are we getting all this information about studies being done about odors? Because I'm involved in a few other areas that we have cannabis growing, and there is no such study that has been completed with specific parameters telling us what is good about the odor, what is bad about the odor. And yes, I'm not a user by any stretch of any imagination, and cannabis does stink. I am aware of that, but we can't recommend as a town that we're going to make a recommendation according to the odor. There is no specific parameters. I mean, we can beat around the bush all we want. There's so many things out there that smell, and we don't have a specific idea which is harmful, which isn't, and at what time the cannabis is actually harmful to anybody that's around it. So if the recommendation is going to be put out there about odor, we have to have specifics. And in order to have those specifics, we better have some factual data, not just one study done by one independent. That doesn't fly for anybody. We all know that. We have to have 2 or 3 different studies and that tell us, okay, it's harmful at this stage, it's not harmful. Yes, it does emit some odor that people don't like, but that's a fact of where you choose to live. You can't just say, okay, if it produces this odor, you can't have it. I understand that, and I'd be opposed to it too if somebody put it up near where I live. But on the fact is that if we're going to recommend this, we have to have more data on the odor. We can't just put that as a recommendation. There has to be specific parameters, but we have to have history showing why we're putting it in there, harmful or not.
I'd be happy to answer this one. So you've actually accurately depicted. There's odor. There's substantial odor from cannabis growing. You've identified
times,
that.
right?
So yes, when it's in bud.
Yes.
Right? So in indoor production facilities are designed to have it in bud often throughout the year. And so for people that are living in a home with no cannabis facility, and a cannabis facility comes into their neighborhood, why should they be subject to an odor? Whether it's hazardous or not, that's not determined. The issue is there an odor? And yes, there is an odor that's emanated from these facilities. So because of that odor, and because we don't want to subject the citizens of this municipality to be subject to an odor for an area that they've already bought and they've already purchased and they already live in, we require that facilities be designed that no odor be emitted from these facilities. And to be absolutely sure that these residents will not be subject to odor, we're proposing to require, it's up to council, but we're proposing to require 150 meter separation. That ensures that these people who are living there and have bought their homes will not be subject to odor. So that's the rationale.
Okay, I accept the rationale. There's not an issue there. But to what extreme? There's no such thing as 100% odorless cannabis production. No such thing, right? So
that's correct.
And that's what I'm saying. I don't know how or where are you going to get these numbers as how much can it smell for how far or how long? I mean, if you have a cannabis grow area that produces 3 different harvests a year, there's a specific 2 weeks for every time it harvests. it's going to smell like crazy. Now, how are we going to set the numbers that's allowed to smell? Is it going to be 1%, 2%? Because there's no data saying what a percentage. Now, I'm agreeing with what you said as far as should we allow someone to put up a cannabis grow area where there's homes? The other side of that is, and I guess maybe I misread it or misunderstand it, if there is an existing cannabis facility, let's say, for instance, in the one that Eleanor has in St. Catharines, and there is allowable development areas for residential sites within the 150 meters, and people decide to develop that site and put up a new home, do they have the right now to turn around and say to the cannabis grower, no, you can't continue growing because you're emitting odors that are going to hamper us? How do you decipher that? We have to be a little more clear. I'm not here to argue with you guys. I just want to make sure that we get certain things clear.
Let me parse that out in a couple of your questions, because you started off with one question and answered a second. The first question you asked about was, how do we determine what is a proper odor?
Yeah.
As I said,
Yeah.
Our proposal is that the facilities emit no odor. We're not suggesting that we determine what's a proper odor or not a proper odor. It's no odor. So if you walk up to the facility, there should be no odor being emitted from that facility, period. Okay, so that's to answer your first question. The second question is, if a facility is legally operating currently in the municipality, and this zoning comes in and it, for instance, requires 150 meters and they're only at 100, because they already legally exist under the zoning bylaw, they're legally allowed to continue to operate with no restrictions or no further restrictions unless they wanted to expand. So anybody that's legally operating would not be subject to these policies. They become, or zoning, they become what's called legal non-conforming. So they can continue to operate.
Okay, that's fair. The no odor though, do you know of a facility that produces zero odor?
Yes, if it's properly done with proper filtration, they can address that. But there is a danger that odor can be emitted for certain reasons on a rare occasion, and that's why we're requiring the 150 meter separation distance, just to ensure that's further separation.
I think you're getting closer to what I'm looking at. So what I'm saying is, every facility at one point, whether it's done purposefully or something happens, every facility always has a time period that produces some odor. And I'm just trying to say, okay, let's just say that we do have a facility in town, and one harvest time it produces odor and you get complaints. And obviously you're going to go there and you're going to say, okay, guys, what happened? And they give you a reason. Well, it was harvest time and our filtration system allowed 5% of the odor to go out. Then it happens again. And then it happens again. We all know you can't get a, I know the idea is to get zero, and that'd be fantastic. But what happens if they keep emitting and it's almost impossible to eliminate those 5%? I just can't see a 0%. When do you decide, well, zero is zero and we won't allow anything more than zero? How do you measure that?
So let me start with your first premise. Your first premise was that the filtration would allow 5% out. The requirement is the filtration requires zero out.
Yeah.
That is the requirement. If someone cannot meet it, then they're in violation of the zoning bylaw, and it'll be in violation of their site plan agreement. So that is a restriction. Despite that, because there's the danger that could happen, that's why we're requiring 150 meter separation, 500 meters to other sensitive uses. So the premise is not 5%, the premise is zero.
Yes.
And they have to demonstrate that.
Okay. So
I would add in as well, Franco, just as an additional thing, certainly if there is an issue with odor, and it is because our zoning bylaw, again, assuming that council, approves the amendments that we're proposing, if someone is in contravention of the bylaw, then we have ways of enforcing that. And so if there are, multiple events where it becomes an issue, we have tools and methods to deal with that once everything's sort of been finalized. So if someone's essentially a repeat offender, that we have the ability then to deal with that.
So if someone makes an application now into the town and they provide you with the mechanicals that are required to produce zero emissions, who in the town is going to be able to say, oh, that's good enough, or that's not good enough, or who's going to be able to regulate that, or how do you get it approved and say, okay, we accept that? Or are we just going to, are we going to rely on the engineers that are preparing those documents?
So that would all be submitted through the site plan process. And what we've done with a couple of previous site plans is we have had that peer reviewed by a professional. So that would most likely be the process moving forward as well.
All right.
Lindsay, that does bring us to the 10-minute mark. Did you have any kind of concluding thoughts, Franco?
No, my biggest issue is the odor, because we all know that the town of Fort Erie in the past has had numerous facilities producing a lot worse odors, and it was never looked at, basically because nobody knows how to measure odors. We could all like one odor and 5 other people don't like it. When do you decide what's right and what's wrong? And it just seems that just because a few people don't like the odor of cannabis, we're going to make it a rule that somebody can't grow cannabis. I don't think you're going to win that battle in court. Unless we have specific guidelines, we're not going to win that battle. That's my only thing. Odor, I like the idea, but I don't think we have enough data or parameters that are really going to make it work. So 0 is great. I don't think you can achieve 0. Appreciate your
Thanks,
time.
Franco. Appreciate those comments, though. That we appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we will be moving on to our next speaker. We'll be moving on to speaker number 4 at this time. So I will be bringing them in. And just to note, this is a call-in user.
Hi, Lindsay.
Hey, Russ, how are you?
I'm good. I loved everybody that called so far.
Awesome.
Okay, now I didn't catch the guy's name who's talking for the city.
It's Paul.
Hello?
Paul Lowe's with SGL.
Oh, okay. Hey, Paul. Here's something that I don't think you or anybody's considered, that a commercial grow, chances are the house right next door that's being 150 meters away is probably growing weed too. In case you missed it, everybody's growing weed. There's so much cannabis around right now. There is a glut. So if a commercial grow is surrounded by farmers and people who are all growing weed, let's face it, you got to fill your lunch kid or grandkid in your house. Instead of giving them $100 every week, you grow some weed and you give them that. And you give them $5 for zigzags. So the entire city was growing weed this year. I would say over 50% of all the homes in Fort Erie had several plants in their backyard. So to mitigate stink of weed, the only way you're going to do it is by trying to coax the people into using cannabis that doesn't stink. I caught a couple of people trying to steal my outdoor weed. When the cops showed up, the one cop says, "I don't smell no weed." He says, "You sure you're growing weed?" I said, "Do you smell strawberries?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, why would you want anything that smells like a skunk if you can have strawberries, blueberries, mangoes?" And the terpene value, that is exactly what creates the odors of cannabis. Now, I took a corporate compliance course, and I'll be honest with you, I thought it was complete and utter hype. For all the people who missed the Toronto Star business page today, the cannabis stores, let's see, growing competition means hazy outlook for pot shops. They're going to go belly up. Tilray, they're belly up. Other corporate cannabis companies, they're looking for a government handout. I asked Vance Vadaway, I said, well, if they want a handout, tell them to fire everybody first, because if you're not making money growing weed, then something's wrong. So, and anybody that wants to enter the cannabis trade right now, it is the only commodity that is tanking. Does anybody on this panel know what an ounce of weed goes for in the street right now? $60 to $80. So the corporate world of cannabis is never going to compete with that. And the genie's not going back in the bottle. If there's so many people growing weed for a laugh, and everybody knows this, that a corporate grower has a bottom line. And with all the new regs coming in, you're going to end up like spiking the price even worse. So the people that have to buy it, the end user, they're literally going to be paying too much, and they're going to hit the street. At any given day in Fort Erie, up till now, there was probably 40 to 60 weed dealers in Fort Erie. Street dealers. Right now, I would bet you there's 5,000. Do you think anybody's going to throw $500, $1,000 worth of weed in a green bin and dump kitty litter on it? Anybody who believes that, they're deluded. You might as well keep buying pot stocks then. So, as a person who considered corporate growing and designated growing, the designated growers are important. If you can't manage to grow your own medical cannabis, you need these people. However, when it comes to growing your own personal medical marijuana, you have high numbers. Like, for instance, I'm allowed 35 plants outside. If there was a corporate grow a block away from me, you'd be over there giving him a ticket for emitting odors. Meanwhile, it's his neighbor, me. Does anybody understand what I'm saying? Hello?
Yeah, no, and again, Russ, I think as we've sort of chatted, what we are looking at regulating is more the commercial growth, right? So it's the bigger guys. We're not really looking at.
Okay, did you follow what I just said though, Lindsay? If the person is growing their personal weed next to a corporate grow, how can you expect a corporate grow not to get the fallout of the neighbor who's growing weed for either a laugh or for their own personal medicine?
No, and
because seriously,
comment. And I think in that case, I mean, again, if all of these regulations go through and we end up, in an enforcement issue, that's the role of bylaw to go in and have a look at that commercial facility and make that determination of whether or not it truly is the one that's emitting odor. Certainly, I can understand that, folks are
like 150 meters. You can't tell, Lindsay. I mean, seriously, like in my neighborhood, 12 houses out of 16 had plants in their backyard. That's a majority. So the smell of cannabis is everywhere. And the people who are growing it like commercially, to mitigate the stink, it's going to be pinned on them from somebody else. But I'll get back to this. We just witnessed what happened in Glasgow, Scotland with climate change. Okay? Taking everybody and forcing them to grow indoors, you're heating the room and you're exhausting the heat. Now, I mean, if anybody has never been in a grow room, and I mean a huge grow room, they are like a constant. It's kind of like they're basically like the water around a baby bottle. When you get into a huge grow, the temperature is hot, and there's no snow around like a major corporate grow. The plant is heating up. We don't need no more like forced indoor growing. For instance, every page of every business newspaper in North America today was like basically writing about how bad cannabis is doing. And now we're hearing people say, what if somebody wants to break into the business in Fort Erie? They need a psychiatrist. Because the cannabis business right now is like seriously in the toilet. The people that are like growing like designated growers, the people that are growing designated, they are into it for half the crop. Where is that cannabis going? This is such a free-for-all. The best thing the city could do is step back for 2 years and just let everybody do what they want until they sort it out. The best thing you could do is guide people. To try to force them through legislation? I mean, literally, I was part of the Conroy Allard Challenge in Victoria, the Supreme Court of Canada, and marijuana people are stubborn. They're peaceful, but they fight with their words and they fight with their determination. Why else do you think cannabis is legal right now? And for instance, if you want to be able to determine this, there is a machine and it reads the terpenes. The terpenes are the odors. So you could say, like, I'm an expert on cannabis odor mitigation. I'm literally telling you the terpenes that smell like skunk are humulene. I have no single cannabis. I grow 10 kinds of cannabis. Not one of them have humulene in them. Humulene is what the smell is coming off of hops and or skunk weed. And I gave you do remember, Lindsay, I gave you the seed bank sheet? Hello?
Yeah, sorry, it's hard when you're on the phone. Yeah, no, I did receive that, so thank you.
Okay, now here's the thing. On that sheet, every single strain of cannabis that has a name that sounds like fruit, nuts, or spices, that's good, what it's going to smell like. Well, if there's anything that says skunk next to it, the people that live in town, you don't want to, like, people that are growing medical weed commercially or for recreation, very few people want stinky, skunky weed anymore. So when you go on and about, like, certain people say, it smells like this, it smells like that. I had a cop 2 feet away from 30 plants. Couldn't smell the weed. I had Mayor Wayne in my grow, couldn't smell the weed. I had your bylaw guy, John, in my indoor and with my outdoor. And I'm not a small medical grower, by no means. And I really don't want to be a designated grower. And the commercial, if I would have invested anything in it, I'd be kicking myself in the can right now. Because, quite simply, the cannabis industry is going to collapse. Tilray, the biggest cannabis business in the world, literally is belly up. So I say all the power to the people, and to come down on people over cannabis odor. Seriously, there is no study that is picking apart the terpenes. I never heard your guest say once anything about terpenes, and that is where cannabis odor comes from. And if you knew anything about cannabis mitigating the stink of certain terpenes, not the strain specific, then I would understand that the people know what they're talking about. But without anybody mentioning terpenes, which come in everything, you get it in black pepper, you get it in pineapple, you get it in mangoes. So if you're growing an entire garden that smells like mangoes, like, who's going to be mad at you?
Well, thanks,
I
Ross.
hope this is making sense.
Sorry, that does bring us to the 10-minute mark. So if you just have
okay,
any
well, hey, you got to
thoughts.
keep it coming because there's more to come. But remember, the neighbor, their cannabis is going to offset everything. And I'll probably try to get a hold of John Bridgman tomorrow and see what he thinks. But, hey, keep it coming. Don't invest in weed.
Thanks, Russ.
Be well. Thanks, Lindsay.
Have a great night.
I'll hang in there.
Okay, bye now.
Okay, so we've gone through all of our registered speakers at this time, Lindsay. How would you like to proceed at this point? It doesn't look like we have anybody who didn't register to speak in the waiting room at this time.
Okay, perfect. And does anyone else, any of the other sort of previous speakers, if anyone else has anything to add, if you want to just raise your hand, that would be great. If not, then I think we will just sort of plug the presentation on for folks to have a look at. And if there are any other sort of questions or comments that come up in the next, we're here for the next hour. So if anything comes up that anyone would like to ask us about or chat about, we will sort of be here virtually and just sort of raise your hand and you know, we can answer any questions that folks might have. I think that's what we'll do.
Great. So I'm not seeing any virtual hands raised at this time, but like Lindsay mentioned, we'll be keeping an eye on it. So feel free to do so. And just as a reminder, you can do that by pressing the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. But yeah, maybe I'll get the PowerPoint presentation looping now. Lindsay.
Great.
Oh, and we actually had one question in the chat come in. Can you confirm the time and location if in person for the December 6th session?
I can, here we are. Yeah, so John, that is December 6th. It will be held virtually, but sort of through council. So it's at a council meeting, but it's a virtual public meeting. But let me confirm that with everyone, and we'll see how that goes. But it would start at 6 o'clock, which is our normal sort of council start time. Generally, it doesn't quite start at 6 o'clock because they go through a few other things before they get to the public meetings, but generally that's sort of the time for that. The information for that can be found on the community planning section of the website. And there's essentially what it happens is there's a link that's available, and folks can click on that and then participate as they'd like to. So that's sort of it for now. But I can certainly, everyone that's sort of attended and everyone that has, informed and provided me with emails and addresses and everything will all get notice of that meeting and the methods to provide comment at that point. So thank you. Good question.
All right, so I will get the presentation running then. Hi, Franco. I do see that you have your hand up, so we will be bringing you in shortly. Just give us a few moments, please. Lindsay, are you okay if I bring Franco back in? Excellent.
Yeah.
Hey, Franco.
Sorry to bring you back into this. You can hear me?
Can hear you fine.
Lindsay, remember I spoke to you about this before. Am I to the understanding right now that we're recommending no outdoor growth at all?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. I don't know if you remember, I said, so what happens if somebody has 500 acres in the middle of Timbuktu in Fort Erie? Why can't we set a limit to a percentage of his acreage that he can grow the marijuana? Because he's not going to be he's going to be far enough away from everybody. He's not going to be impeding on anybody's property. He's going to be far enough for odor and that. Why can't we say, okay, and this is just an example, he's got 500 acres, he's allowed to use 10% of his acreage for cannabis growth?
That's a fair question. And we sort of did chat about, having that as a permitted use or how to look at that. But at the end of the day, we felt that, and especially based on how strong the odor can be and how far it can travel, that it would be in everyone's best interest just to prohibit outdoor growth as a blanket prohibition. Again, it's difficult. We didn't look at every single agricultural property that was out there and sort of figure what they could or could not do. I think at the end of the day, we wanted to make sure that this issue wasn't going to be a nuisance issue. There's also other considerations like security and all of these other sort of requirements that are put out by the federal government and the provincial government to regulate the use. So we just felt that it was cleaner and easier just to say no outdoor growing and leave it at that. So that was essentially the rationale. And a lot of municipalities are going that way. That was sort of what we got from the best practices as well. So
I understand, but you still have, regardless of who it is or what it is, they still have to follow all the federal rules and regulations set out there. So they follow all those. And you're mystifying me with this thing is you guys feel that it's best you do that. It's not about what we feel. Regardless whether I'm a pro or con at this, it doesn't matter. It's not about what we feel. If a guy has 500 acres, if he's got 1,000 acres, and there's a few farmers around there that have close to 2,500, 3,000 acres. Yes, they lease the property and it's not all theirs. How do you restrict somebody that has that much property that there's no way in the world he's going to affect anybody because he's ultimately out in the middle of nowhere to say, no, we're not going to let you grow that product? It's an agricultural product. That's why I'm thinking maybe you have to look at the numbers maybe a little bit closer. Because if the guy, for instance, I know you're worried about the guy that's maybe within 300 meters of a residential area and he's only got 5 acres. Well, obviously, if he's only allowed 10%, he's only going to be able to use 1 acre. At 1 acre, he can't even produce enough pot or grow enough pot to even ultimately make hardly any smell. Because it just doesn't allow, it won't work. You need a lot of space for that outdoor growth. 1 pot plant outside, you almost need 64 square feet, an 8x8 area. So if you do the math, it's ultimately never going to affect anybody because you have to have 8x8. Then you have to leave a 6-foot swath between plants. If you don't, you're going to run into huge problems, probably mold, you're going to cross contamination and all that. So I think, I don't know, am I beating the bush or am I going down the wrong path? Or maybe you got to look at, allow a percentage and maybe set a minimum. Nothing under 10 acres, anything over 10% of what you own.
Yeah, no, and again, it was something that we sort of looked at, but at the end of the day, I think the sort of the pros outweighed the cons, and again, that the indoor growth was really the what we heard from the public, from other municipalities. It's working elsewhere, and so that was sort of why we went that way with what we came up with. I get what you're saying. I totally do. But again, at the end of the day, in order to deal with those nuisance issues, the key kind of component was to make sure that they maintained the indoor, or that they were contained indoors.
Yeah. So before, when Mr. Lowe's brought up the thing, or the thought is after 150 meters, the smell pretty much dissipates to a non-existing factor. Does that also happen with the outdoor growth? Probably is my best question.
No, outdoor growth is well beyond 150 meters. Well beyond 150 meters.
Okay, so what would it be in your?
It all depends on the wind direction. That's why we're not recommending outdoor growth, because depending on the size, the wind conditions, it could be 750, it could be a kilometer.
Yeah.
So that's why we're not recommending outdoor growth.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Welcome.
So we've reached 7 o'clock, which is the end of our meeting time. I'd like to thank everyone for participating in our open house this evening. There was some really good discussion, some great questions and comments. So we're going to be taking that back and incorporating that into our reports for council. So thank you again for those comments and that discussion. We'll like to note that, feel free to follow up directly if you do have any other questions or comments that you'd like to ask about the proposed amendments. And please remember to visit Let's Talk Fort Erie for more information and again to stay informed. A really, really big thank you to Mackenzie for keeping us organized, and also to Paul and Suzanne for joining us this evening. To everyone, please continue to stay safe and healthy and have a great rest